And we're going to start.
The pool's been chilly lately.
Recording. Record to the cloud. Okay. I think now if we want to share, we got to share. Share that. Last thing we need to do is we need to get this to the screens. Do that. Going here. Send to cast. And you have to wake them up. Supposed to wake up. Looks like it's restarting. Almost ready. Okay, while we're waiting for the technology to wake up, this is class 5. Everybody is invited to join us again next week for class 6. And I also want to invite everybody to join us next Tuesday evening. Is Shavuot Eve. And we will be having a dinner at 9:15, a free dinner for all participants in JLI courses from this past year. We'll then have TED Talks, Torah Talks, 3 or 4 Torah Talks, and then a discussion. I don't know why this is not working. It's one of those days. Then we'll have a Torah discussion on situation in Israel, some of the controversial issues, and try to understand what Torah's perspective is on that. So everybody's invited to join us for that. And we'll also be giving out, there's something called a siyum. A siyum is when you complete Torah study. You celebrate the completion of Torah study. And we're going to kind of look at Shavuot Eve as a completion of Torah study of this year and a commitment and a resolve to pick up Torah study anew, which is a great time to do that on Shavuos when we commemorate the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So you'll all be getting an email with some of the details, and I hope you'll join us. Please sign up so we can know how much dinner to prepare. It is late, but that's what we do. We study late at night on Shavuot Eve. We'll have plenty of coffee and cheesecake, candies there again, to keep you, and other delicious foods to keep you awake and interested. All right, enjoy the class, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi Edelman.
Thank you. All right. So imagine you had a hotel, an infinitely large hotel.
Is it live?
It should be. It's going, right? Live,
Yeah.
live stream. Yeah. infinitely large hotel, infinitely many rooms. And they are all booked, person in every room. In walks a new guest. So what do you do now? How do you fit your new guest in?
This is our power, right?
Yeah. So the answer is you just make everyone move up one room. Right? There's no end to the rooms of the hotel. So if you just move every guest over one to the, whoever was in room 1 now moves to room 2 and so on. Now you'll have an empty room in room 1. Now you got a space for one more guest.
Don't make everybody move.
Yes, of course. Practically wouldn't do it. Now, how many times could you do that? How many times could you move everyone up one number so that there's an extra room? What do you think? How many times could you do it?
If there's infinite
I'm
rooms,
just gonna say that.
Infinitely many times. So if you have an infinite hotel that's infinitely booked, you could fit infinitely many more people in it. This is called the Grand Hotel Paradox, that infinity can fit infinity within it infinitely many times. There's just no end to it. What this really tells you is that infinity is not really a number. It's not what we call countable. It's not like you get there at the end of counting. It just doesn't end. So if I said, what's infinity plus 1? That's not a real statement. Infinity plus 1 is the same thing as saying purple plus 1. Like it's not a logical statement. Infinity is not a number in the number system. So the same thing is true of infinity minus 1. Infinity minus 1 is also not a number. You don't get closer to infinity by counting, and you don't get further from infinity by subtracting. Well, this presents a problem because somehow, some way, we went from infinity to not infinity. It started off with the Or Ein Sof, the light of no end, the infinite light before creation. And then we get not infinite light, not Or Ein Sof. How did that happen? How did we go from infinity to not infinity? And we know that it can't happen through subtraction. Subtraction is not going to get you away from infinity. That's our big question of the class. How do we go from infinite God, divinity, infinite light, to where we are right now? And furthermore, before creation, everything felt like God. Everything is God. But if I look around at this room, I see a bunch of things that don't feel like God. In fact, the Kabbalistic definition of physicality is that which doesn't feel like God. I look at this cup, I don't see God. Bam, that's what we call physical. Spiritual are things that we see the divinity within them. So if God is infinite, how did we get from infinity to finite? And how did we get from God to something that doesn't feel like God? How did we get to us? We wake up in the morning and we don't feel like God. I mean, hopefully. It's most of us. So how did that happen? That's our big question. Where's the quantum leap that started it all? So we're going to read text 1. One of the most central texts in Kabbalah. And we'll start from this side this time. Start from you over here. You go to text 1.
Before Atzilus was emanated and before the creations were created, a simple divine light filled all of reality. It had no aspect of beginning or end. It was called Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. When it arose in his will to create the worlds and to emanate Atzilus, he contracted his infinite light, and an empty space emerged. He then projected downward a single straight line from his circular light, evolving into this empty space. Within this empty space, he emanated, created, fashioned, and made all worlds.
So there we have it. One of the most central texts in Kabbalah is the creation of finity, the opposite of infinity. What God did is he did what's called tzimtzum harishon. Tzimtzum means contraction, removal. The first tzimtzum, the contraction that leads from infinity to the opposite of infinity, is infinity minus infinity, essentially. Remove everything. Don't take away some, take away all. If you minus a certain number from infinity, you're still left with infinity. The way to get to not infinity is to take it all away. Infinity minus infinity. Creating an empty space. And then in that empty space comes a single line of revelation, a finite line of revelation. So it's infinity minus infinity plus something finite. This is called Tzimtzum Harishon, creating the empty space, the first contraction creating the empty space, and then the Kav, the line, the single line of revelation. This is the process of creation. So often, what's described here as is an empty space that's circular with a line between. Now, these are very physical terms, right? The biggest risk in Kabbalah is physicalizing what we read about, because our limited minds have a hard time grasping just, spiritual things. We're trying to understand color as blind people. That's what we're doing here. So we use the circle because it implies infinity and going on forever. And then the line represents finity, something very small. And so the finite goes into this empty space created, and all of us, all of our worlds, everything created, all the four worlds are within that line of creation, the line of a small part of God's revelation. So that is called the kav, the line, and the igul, the tzimtzum, the empty space that God created. So it's very important to understand that we are not talking literally here. It's very easy to read this and say, you know what? You know what I learned in Kabbalah class today? I learned that there was a time where there was no God in an area. God just said, I'm not going to be here today. That's not what's happening. In fact, this paragraph was extremely controversial. There were arguments about this, what's common is people call each other heretics over these types of things. That's what happened. You believe it this way, you're a heretic. You think it that way, you don't read in the text correctly. How do you understand the concept of God taking away everything? So it's almost kind of like the rock that God can't pick up. Can God make a rock that he can't pick up? Can God create a space where he is not? So some people read this literally. So there's a time where God makes a space where there's no God there. And this is one of the biggest mistakes in Kabbalistic history, reading it that literally. Have to read it as not removal, but concealment. I like to imagine this as light rays. If you have light, there's light rays bouncing all around this room, right? Hidden our eyes of different frequencies. If you were to take all the frequencies of light hitting our eyes and say, how many of them can we see? The visible spectrum of light is really small. Our eyes are only attuned to a very narrow range of frequencies, which we see as different colors. Then you have, gamma rays, you've got ultraviolet, all those different things that we can't see. It doesn't mean they're not there. It means that we're not attuned to them. So if I would create a machine that would take all the light in this room and just make its frequencies higher or lower, the room would become dark. I wouldn't be able to see anything. But there would be the same amount of light rays as there was before. Just now I can't see it. That's kind of what we mean when we talk about God making a space. God making a space is saying, I'm going to make the divinity invisible, not able to be felt. Because if you can feel it, then there's not going to be space for you. If you can feel God, you can't feel yourself. And I want to create something that's outside of it. So God says, I'm going to make myself invisible, and then there will be space for there to be creation.
Still saying God is still near, though, even though he's visible.
Yes.
Here.
100%.
Can't see.
Exactly. Everywhere. Even in the things that we call physical. Physical is the things that don't appear godly. That's just a lack of awareness on our part. this cup is as divine as the light prior to the Tzimtzum. It has to be. It's just that here is the stuff that we can't see. If we were transported to before the Tzimtzum, before the contraction, we would see it and then we would cease to exist immediately, because we can't exist with that revelation of God at the same time. So it's important, though, that to understand that these are described as shapes, and it's easy to get stuck in the shapes. You'll see these. We have charts with circles and lines everywhere. It's very easy to get stuck in them. And historically, people have. Like, they became Kabbalistic experts, which meant that they could draw the charts with more lines than everyone else. There was a famous chassid whose name was Shmuel Munkes. He was known as the Hasidic prankster. He used to pull Hasidic pranks all the time. So one time, he met a young man who was a self-proclaimed expert in Kabbalah. And the man said, I know all this stuff. I learned everything. So Shmuel Munkes said, hey, I have a Kabbalistic text I'm having trouble with. Can you please help me out? And the man says, yeah, sure. I'll do it. So Shmuel Munkes gives him, it says, take some of it, make it into a line, then it makes it into a circle. Then it's folded with 3 points and a dot in the middle and put through fire. Well, what is this referring to? So the man starts explaining. So there's a separate space. God takes a space out, and there's a line, and the 3 corners represent the 3 spheros. Then Shmuel says, oh, shoot, I forgot. This is my wife's recipe for making meat dumplings. I'm sorry. It was a mistake. Take a line of dough, spread it into a circle, put meat in the middle, fold the sides over, put it into the fire, and man, you get a meat dumpling. But it's easy to take that and start reading Kabbalistic meanings into everything if all you've got is shapes. So I just want to, encourage us that we're talking about shapes a lot, but really we're referring to deeper spiritual things going on. Don't get stuck in the shapes too much. So in reality, it isn't like God takes away himself and then there is no God in this area. It's just that now whatever was there doesn't experience that godliness. So we're going to read about the errors that certain people made in history reading this section of the Zohar. Want to read text 2 for us? 2a?
Those who wish to understand Tzimtzum in a literal manner will be at least to contradict most of the fundamentals of our faith. First of all, we are explicitly taught to whom do you fear God, what makes likeness you can arrange for him. However, you take the Tzimtzum literally, you are indeed clothing the image of God, encompassing circle and empty space, straight channel within that space.
So if you take infinite light and you say there's a space where it's not, well, then you've minused from infinity. That's what you've done. If you describe it as very literal, then you've made infinity where there's one area where it's not. That's just not God anymore. That's the first error. By trying to make this empty space, you've taken away from the fact that God is omnipresent and that God is infinite. Then there's the second error. Want to read the second error for us? Text 2b.
Additionally, the Zohar states numerous times that there is no place where he is not, from the highest of levels to the lowest of levels, and in every direction. If you suggest that the Simpson is literal, you're insinuating there is a place devoid of him, where in this empty space only a narrow channel descended.
So there was a rabbi, I can't remember his name, man. He wrote a book called There Is One. And he wrote it because he saw that people didn't understand the omnipresence of God. He walked into the yeshivas and he'd say, all right, question for you. Is God in the bathroom? They're like, God, is God in the bathroom? No, God's not in the bathroom. Okay, God is not in the bathroom. So who's in the bathroom? And he would point out, like, any place on earth that you can imagine, the most unholy place that you can imagine, has the same divinity as every other place on earth. There is no place apart from where God is. There's just places where we feel it more and places where we feel it less. So it's very important to not think of this as a removal. And it's also important to remember that you are in a synagogue or it feels more holy. In reality, you are as close to God in the synagogue as you are in your house, on your toilet. That's the reality. And we're in some sense supposed to feel like this. David HaMelech in Psalms, he says, I place God before me always. Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Samid. Which means that he lived like that. He lived like God is everywhere. And the same level of respect for God I have when walking into the synagogue is the same respect I have in every other place in my life. And so when I am doing everything, I'm doing it in the presence of God. And that's the ideal. The ideal is that we feel that. But unfortunately, us limited humans do have an emotional sense where we are more aware of it sometimes and less aware of it sometimes. But logically, everywhere is equally God-filled. So what does it mean then to remove God? If God being removed doesn't mean that God is not there, so what does it mean? So we read text 3. This is from the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, explaining the concept of tzimtzum, concealment. Want to read text 3 for us?
Simpson, it's not named God's infinite life recorded for truth. There's no place to avoid it. The principle is also expressed in the mid. Why did God choose to reveal himself to those things which were within the form? To teach that there is no place to avoid God's presence, even a foreign. Indeed, in this context, Tzimtzum is that or Ein Sof went from a state of revelation to one of concealment, not actually departing at all.
So it's just here, but not seen, equally seen. So the people who read it literally, their main objective was that it felt wrong to say that God was in the bathroom. Just felt wrong. And we can understand that. The Baba Rebbe would say often that we have to be sympathetic with their desire to honor God, because it's hard to imagine God in the bathroom the same way God is in the synagogue. But that's, again, a limited human vision, where there is holy and unholy, and God is somehow affected by it. What we do somehow changes divinity. That's not the reality. The reality is that God is infinitely everywhere at all times. And the only question is, what are our eyes able to see? And what is our heart able to feel? So what happened was we had a place where you felt God. And when you feel God, there's no space for self. So God said, I'm creating a possibility to not feel me. And then I'm going to just shine a little bit of revelation, a little bit, to create something. Because without any godliness at all, you also don't get anything either. No godliness doesn't create creations. It creates nothing. So you have a space where you don't feel God, and then a tiny drop of godliness that we can exist, but still feel somewhat separate from God. So to understand this, what Chassidus usually does is give examples and parables. The difference between Kabbalah and Chassidus generally is Kabbalah is the knowledge without the parables. Just tell you the information, the lines, the circles, and leave it at that. And what Chassidus does is it says, okay, but we're a little bit too low to get that as it is. So if we want to understand it, we need to use parables and examples to get a little bit closer to understanding it. So what's the parable? What's the parable for this? So there are multiple, but one of the parables that Chassidus gives is a teacher. Say you are a 4th grade teacher. Walk into the room, there's a bunch of students there. You're trying to explain the concept of gravity to 4th grade students. You, in preparation for that, read through all of Isaac Newton's papers, you read through Einstein's theory of general relativity, and you're ready to go. And you show up. What are you going to say? What are you going to say? The amount of information that you have to share is so overwhelming that if you teach it, your students will get nothing. Can't give anything like that. So what you have to do is you got to stop and say, okay, let's pretend that I don't know anything. Let's pretend that all this information that I have is put to the back burner. I'm going to take one tiny aspect of that knowledge, and I'm going to share that one tiny aspect. One example, one little piece of it. And the students will be able to get that part of it because it's small enough and real enough and close enough to them. And then we can slowly build on that. So that's what a teacher has to do. Remove everything, think of how the student feels and put in tiny drops of information to start with. That's the analogy for the tzimtzum and creation. Take away everything and give a drop. So that little idea, though, has to be a direct part of the larger concept. If you're going to talk about gravity, you have to talk about things falling or why the moon stays in the sky, or something like that. The idea that you're sharing has to have within it the concept, but not so large that it's overwhelming. That's what we have to do. What that means, though, is that the tiny drop of godliness, of divinity, that's within that tzimtzum space, within the empty space, has to carry within it the godliness that's outside of the empty space. When you share this little piece of information, it has within it the essence of the concept, just in a small example. So when God created the Kab, the tiny line of revelation, it also has within it the power of divinity. So that's not good enough, though. Because again, we need to create something that feels separate from God. And just giving this little line of revelation is not enough to create separateness from God. And in Chassidus, this is called yeshus, or isness, the sense that I am. Here I am, all by myself. How do we get that? So Chassidus explains that there's actually a two-step tzimtzum, two-step concealment, two-step contraction to go from the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, to things that feel separate. Step one is what we just talked about, the complete contraction, removal of everything. And then little line of revelation. But that line of revelation is still, inside of it is the power of infinity, still the idea of God. We need to move one step further, which is that the person does not feel part of God, separate from God. The second tzimtzum happens between the world of Atzilus, the highest world, the world of emanation, and the world of Bria, the one level below. In the world of Atzilus, the things there have no yeshus. They don't feel themselves yet. They don't feel separate from God. Bria is the first time you have things that feel separate from God. So how do we get from part of God to not part of God? We need another tzimtzum. This tzimtzum is called the parsa, or the pargod, the curtain. So earlier we talked about taking the light and narrowing down the visible spectrum, or moving the wavelengths higher and lower. So here we have to not just change the amount of light, we have to change the quality of the light. We have to make whatever comes through not feel like it's God directly. So if I would take a flashlight and I'd shine it across the room, you see the circle on the wall, you'll know there's a flashlight from the circle directly. You'll know a lot of things about the flashlight from the circle because light is directly connected to its source. It's a constant stream of photons always shooting out, and by the intensity of the circle on the wall and the size of it, you'll be able to tell what the flashlight is made of. What if I take a little square of see-through green paper and I slide it over the flashlight and I shine it at the wall? You'll see a green circle now. Now, the circle doesn't tell you enough about the flashlight. It doesn't tell you about the color of the light of the actual flashlight. If I make a small hole and I cover the flashlight except for a small hole, I've changed the amount of light, but not the quality of it. But if I take a colored paper, now I've changed the quality of the light itself. I've let only certain wavelengths through. That's the analogy given for the second tzimtzum, moving from exist or not exist, part of God, to exist separate from God, changing the quality of the light. In some sense, this is a more powerful change than the first tzimtzum. The first tzimtzum, you still feel God and now you don't. But in terms of going from infinite to finite, the first one was more powerful. But both are necessary. Step one, remove everything, create a line. Step two, in that line, change the quality of the light so that people can, or Bria, can feel separate from God. So we are going to read Let's see, which text are we up to? Okay, text number 5. I'm going to skip text 4, go to text number 5. Who's up?
In his Intown Jewish discusses the dividing curtain between Azilut and Bria. This curtain is the concealing garment that enables the creation of entities with a sense of independence. It is comparable to a physical screen that conceals light. Although some light succeeds in piercing the barrier, the light is merely a second product of the original light. Other sources explain further that this facade is akin to a parable's words, which entirely conceal the profound message of the analog. For example, consider the parables cited by King Solomon, vested in supernal secrets and mundane ideas, hide the mystical truth. Who reads these parables gains a mere glimmer that is incomparable to the force of.
So the two analogies here. Now we're getting very meta. The analogy for this separation between Atzilus and Bria is an analogy. So if you open up the Song of Songs, King Solomon, you ever read it? It's a little shocking the first time you read it. It's a love song. That's what it is. And yet it's part of Tanakh. It's part of the holy books. People read it every Shabbos. They have a custom to read it Friday night. But if you read it, it just reads like, a romance. That's all it is. So what's going on? Why are we reading it? So what the commentaries explain is that King Solomon was trying to express his love for God. He's trying to express it. He's trying to say, here's how much I love God. How would a person express that? They'd say, okay, let's compare it to the highest level of love that we currently feel, which is the love between spouses. And so by vesting his love for God in the love of spouses, he gave the reader a sense of what he's feeling. So every time you read the Shir HaShir and the Song of Songs, you're supposed to replace the beloved with God. But you could read the entire book without doing that. And then you'll just have a love song. And that's the difference between the two types of contractions and symptoms. One is I take the information and I narrow down, I give only one piece of it. I give only one example. I give, the apple falling from the tree or something like that to give an example of gravity. But that is gravity. And then a parable is where I don't even talk about gravity. I talk about something else entirely that's just related that will help you understand it. A parable doesn't include the actual information. It includes pieces that are somewhat related, somehow related. Parables are useful when even the tiny piece of information is too much. They create a greater distance between the person and the idea. It says that King Solomon was one of the wisest people on earth. How wise was he? He could come up with 1,000 parables. When you first read that, okay, so great. That sounds wonderful. What do we need 1,000 parables for? The idea was if there's a piece of information that's so beyond human intellect that it can't be grasped, he could create 1,000 steps of separation to bring you there. One parable and another parable, each one bringing you a little bit closer to understanding. And that's what parables are supposed to do. A good parable lets you grasp information where you read it, and you're like, oh, that's what you're trying to say. All right, that helps a lot. That's what a good parable does. A bad parable separates it. At the end of the parable, you're like, okay, well, what's the connection? A good parable afterwards, you're like, okay, that helps so much in understanding. So here, the parable for the separation between Bria and Yetzirah is a parable, where it doesn't contain the actual information, but it gets you connected somehow. So between Atzilus and Bria, there's a separation that changes the quality of the light. And now, all of a sudden, what's after that doesn't feel like God. So now we've covered the essential ideas of concealment. from infinity to us. But what's the lessons for us? What's the point? We could learn all about this and come out the other side and we have just information. But the word Torah comes from the Hebrew word for hora'ah. Hora'ah means lesson. There needs to be a lesson. If there's no lesson, then it wasn't that useful in the first place. And perhaps it wasn't even Torah. And that's part of what Hasidus brings to Kabbalah, is saying, all right, that was the information. Now let me help you figure out what the lesson was at the end of it. So what lesson do we learn from, this concept of concealment and contraction? So it's important to note that almost every piece of Kabbalah and Hasidus is reflected within the human. There's a verse, I think it's in Isaiah, it says, "Umibsari echazeh Eloka." From my flesh, I see God. Some people read this as just like a kind of, the beauty of the human body and the complexity of DNA, and all of that reflects on the great divine wisdom. But in Kabbalah, this is saying that we carry within us a reflection of the divine system. As I talked about last time, all of Kabbalah is fractals. It's a Mandelbrot set. You zoom in, you'll find the same patterns. It's always, further in you go, the same patterns arise. So the same patterns that exist in the spiritual realms exist within the human. So everything that we learn about in Kabbalah, we can find the lessons because we are going to have a reflection of that idea within us. So what is the reflection of the Or Ein Sof? What is the human reflection of infinite light? It's a hard question. Any ideas? Love. It's an idea. I don't know how infinite it is, but it could be.
Could it be the human soul aspect? Could it have a connection to that?
Yes. So if you were to point to a human and say, what is the most divine thing that a human has? The answer is the sense of self. The fact that we feel separate, all by ourselves, independent from God. That sense of independence is the most miraculous thing that we have. We exist within God at all times. No place is devoid of him, and yet we feel separate. We feel all by ourselves. That's a really powerful thing. But it's also a dangerous thing because it's so powerful that it could completely cut out godliness. And it can also completely cut out everyone else. The most powerful sense of self obscures everyone else in the room. The narcissist. Just like, to use extreme terms, God is in some sense a narcissist, where there is nothing except for him. But for him, it's true, But for us, the narcissist feels like God, and there's nothing else. So the risk there is that we don't feel other people. We just feel ourselves. We infinitely fill the whole space. We walk into the room and we are the center of the attention. We are the main character of the story. And often that ruins our relationship with other people. And step one is to do tzimtzum. Step one is to contract yourself and say, you know what? Let's pretend I don't exist in this room. What does everyone else need? What does everyone else in the room require? And how can I provide that? The same way, in order for there to be something else, God needed to create that space of concealment. If we want to have relationships with other people, we also need to create that space, that sense of, I'm not thinking about me, I'm thinking about them. Like a teacher walks into a room and tries to teach the classroom without thinking about the students, there's no connection. Actually, I once had a teacher who was doing two things at once. They were giving a class to students and they were creating online content, right? Kind of like this. But they put the online content above the student. They felt like there's 1,000 people who watch me online and there's only 8 people in the room. So I'm not really talking to you. You're like you're the background audience over here. You're the pawns. So if you asked a question in the middle of class that wasn't good, you get upset. You're like, why are you interrupting my class? And you're like, now I have to pause it and edit it out afterwards. And it really felt like he wasn't talking, talking to himself, but I was just sitting there. So sometimes we have that, just a regular conversation. They show up, people sit down next to you to talk, and they really want to talk about themselves. That's why they sat down, so that you get to listen to them. And that's not a great, a great system for connection and relationships. Step one is take away yourself and figure out what's next. There's a story, which we're going to read in text 6a. I think I'm trying to say the story. Stories are better just said. The man who came to, I believe it was the Tzemach Tzedek. Yeah. Tzemach Tzedek was the third Rebbe of Chabad. He had a lot of Hasidim. He was perhaps the height of Chabad Hasidus was the Tzemach Tzedek. Some say he had 1 million Hasidim in Russia. So one day a guy came in and said, Rebbe, I have a big problem. When I'm in the synagogue, when I'm in the study hall, I'm learning Torah, everyone just ignores what I'm saying, steps all over me, and they just disrespect me all the time. What do I do? And the Tzemach Tzedek said to him, when you spread yourself out throughout the entire study hall, there's nowhere to step except for on you. Of course they're stepping on you because they have to just say something. And often people can feel slighted by the actions of others because they feel themselves so much. And that's what he was saying to him. He's saying, if you just stopped, pulled yourself back and said, I'm going to listen as opposed to talk, then they wouldn't be stepping on you. They'd be talking to you. So this is the first lesson of Tzimtzum, is cut ourselves out a little bit. We have the possibility to be infinite in our space, to be infinitely narcissistic, to feel like God. We have to do that first Tzimtzum.
Can I answer your question?
Yes.
So, and it sounds like kind of where he started, is that the reason why you can't feel or become really connected with your godly soul is because you're full of your own self. Is that what you're saying here or no?
Yes. So it's possible to be selfless and still not feel the godly soul, but the more self you feel, the less soul you will feel generally. They are kind of like, it is kind of a zero-sum game in that sense. The ideal would be that you and your godly soul would feel like the same thing, where you would identify with it so intensely that there is no me and godly soul separate. And then the sense of self and the sense of godly soul all are exactly the same. But if you felt that way, though, you would also feel equally one with everyone else around you. Because in Hasidus it explains that the souls, all souls are also bonded together. We all also come from the same one source. So if you felt your soul entirely, you'd also feel everyone else equally as well. So the only way to not feel others is to not really feel your soul. Anyway, so this story, he said specifically, they are stepping over me in the study hall. That's what he said. He said, I get stepped on in the study hall. And so the Tzemach Tzedek said, you spread yourself everywhere in the study hall. So the Rebbe said, this is a very important detail of the story. In the study hall is very important. Because the study hall is a place of learning Torah. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And Torah only arrives on those who are humble. Which is coming up to Shavuos. It says that God chose Mount Sinai. Which mountain is Mount Sinai? Anyone know?
Smallest.
It's the smallest one. Well, actually, we can't find it today. There's theories about where it is. And apparently I think in the 17th century, the Christians went through there and they found a mountain that they claimed it was it. They built a church there, St. Catherine's. Jews don't think it's it, or we're not sure it's it. Why can't we find it? Because it's kind of just a mountain. We know which one is Mount Hermon. We know which one's Mount Tabor because they're all massive mountains that stand out. They stand out from the crowd. But Mount Sinai doesn't. So much that we don't even know which one it is now. So why was Mount Sinai chosen? And the Gemara says, the place where you see the greatness of God, you will automatically also find his humility. Where the mountain that was chosen specifically was Mount Sinai, not the highest mountain. And God decided he could have chosen any plant to make his presence felt in. And he chose a thorn bush. Moses shows up, and God is in the thorn bush. It's probably a tree right nearby, but God didn't choose the tree. He chose the thorn bush again. And the idea is that the more self you feel, the less ability you have to connect with God. And in the essence of Torah is connecting with divine wisdom. And the more you think, the less you can understand what God is thinking. So he's saying in the study hall, even that place where you're supposed to be as humble as possible is where you're spreading yourself out. And that's preventing you from learning. A full cup can't hold any more. So that's the first idea. Tzimtzum in ourselves. Remove ourselves. So we're going to read text 7. Want to read text 7 for us? Mm-hmm.
Simplification is an natural response. God set aside triggered great infinite possibility. He did this to love for us, to raise us up to him. For love induces one to restrict oneself for another. For we, our souls will spontaneously be ignited to reciprocate. We feel motivated to forsake everything in order to please.
Mm-hmm. So we are supposed to emulate God. We're supposed to become like God. And one of doing that is doing what he did. Doing what he did is making space for someone else. That's the essence of existence, is God making space for something else. And so we need to do that as well. Make space for something else. And that's the first lesson. But there is a second lesson. The second lesson is that if you looked at this pattern, it would seem to be a downswing. Tzimtzum automatically looks negative. That's what it starts off with. Revelation of God, lack of revelation of God. That seems to be bad. If I'd ask you just those two steps, which one is better? You would say, naturally, revelation of God. That would be the better option. But in reality, that wasn't the better option. The better option was to make the concealment so that there could be revelation to something that feels outside of God. And often that's life. Life is a step that doesn't look good, but turns out to be good. You know, there's an interesting example of this is the story of Purim. If you look at the story of Purim, and we read it all in 20, 30 minutes, how many years did the story of Purim take from beginning to end? You know, what would you say? From when the first feast until the end of the story. Most people would say, you know, a year, a few months, maybe. It's a 12-year story. What happened was we had a feast. Vashti gets killed. 4 years later, Esther is chosen. And then 7 years later is Haman's decree. So Esther stayed in that palace, trapped in the harem for 7 years. For 7 years, she was just like, I don't know why I'm here. I have no idea what I'm doing here. And then 7 years later, Mordechai says, this is the reason why you were here. You were here for this moment. And sometimes in life it's like that. If we focus on the last 10 minutes, the last week, the last month, we're not going to see the pattern. It just looks like concealment. That's all it looks like. It's just concealment. But if we zoomed out larger, we just looked at a larger time frame, we're going to see how every step led to another step, which led to a better place. Even the places that look dark. So this is this idea that the darkness is the important prerequisite for light. In order to get light, there needs to be darkness beforehand, is reflected everywhere in Judaism. You know, when does Shabbat start? It starts at night. Why does it start at night? It could have started at daytime. Man, we could have chosen any moment on the 24-hour clock we have. Any moment could have been the beginning of the Jewish day. But it specifically was chosen to be night first to try to emphasize that the day ends with light. It doesn't end with darkness. Because that's life also. It's supposed to end with light. So we're going to read text 8a. I'm not sure who's next. Want to volunteer? Go for it.
There is evening and there was morning, one day. This verse informs us that there is no day without a night that precedes it. Why must it be so? Why does a day not exclusively consist of daylight hours, or perhaps just the night hours? Why must it include both evening and morning? Why must night precede the day? The root of the matter is that at the source of creation there was evening before morning, that is, darkness preceded light. For the Tzimtzum preceded the sharing of God's kindness. This darkness-light combination extends to all the worlds, including our world, where night precedes day.
So there's two ways where this gets shown. One of them is the ways that we see it automatically. So there was a story once of a guy in Australia. It's a rabbi in Australia, wakes up middle of the night, he hears sounds. Someone's in his house. He comes downstairs, and there's a masked intruder. And they struggle for a bit, and the masked intruder kicks him in the stomach and runs out. He falls to the ground, terrible pain. He gets taken to the hospital. And they do a scan, and they say, we have bad news and good news. The bad news is the kick ruptured one of your organs. The good news is you had a tumor that we wouldn't have caught. That's the way, the type of light that we see easily, which is the bad leads to an easily seen good. And then there's type 2. Type 2 is a man who was wrongfully accused of a crime and sent to prison for 20 years. 18 years into a sentence, a justice project overturns the case, and out he comes. And he says, those were a good 18 years. Did anything good happen? Did he find all of a sudden something? No, he just decided that the rest of his time in prison would be a good time. And this happened, and the man is honest. He says, I decided, I came in and said, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be happy here. And so it was a good time. It wasn't like he found some sort of deeper, it just decided that it was going to be good. And when he decided, it was good. So those are two ways that the darkness becomes light. Sometimes it's the massive, all of a sudden, in-your-face revelation of how it really was good. And then there's the good that we find and we create in ourselves. In the darkness, we say, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use it. And when we do that, it is light. It becomes light. Not because it necessarily was light, but because we decided that it was light. And both of those options are possible. And every darkness needs to be viewed as an opportunity. You need to say, this darkness is a chance to make light, to make the light brighter. In a dark room, the light's much more powerful. If I light a candle right now in this room, it doesn't make much of a difference. If I light it at night with the lights off, it will be a big difference. So our lives are full of darkness. And we need to do two things. We need to zoom out and see where the darkness leads, and we need to view the darkness as an opportunity to create light. We need to do what God did, make space for others, and make space in our lives to find the better, to find the beauty coming. So we're going to read text 8b. This is from the 5th Rebbe of Chabad, who explains this. Who's up? Any volunteers? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to read it.
We observe the same pattern reflected in the affairs of the world, whereby individuals do not achieve growth in wealth, leadership, building the family, study, or any other accomplishment without first experiencing humiliation, pain, loss, and the like. For example, individuals engaged in study will not arrive at a complete understanding of the subject without much toil and stress, feeling distant from understanding and tempted to despair from mastering the subject. Indeed, the Talmud states, one does not understand statements of Torah without first being mistaken. We observe the same in earning a livelihood, whereby we succeed only after putting forth great effort and enduring much pain, even feeling despair. Only thereafter will we find profit and great blessing. This is the way that God's blessings flow in the upper worlds and travel down to the lowest realm. There is no light without the darkness that precedes it. As it is stated, according to the pain is the...
So when we are in that darkness point, when we can't see the light that's coming, we still need to feel like this is useful and important and powerful. You know, they say that, I think it's like 60% of startups fail within the first year. But if you ask the people whose startups succeeded, they'll usually say it's their third one, and they learned so much from the first two. And even the failures are part of success. Even when it's not working out, it's part of what will work out. And when you think about that what's not working teaches us what we will be doing right, then it's not a failure. It's just part of the process of success. So when things are darkest, we can't get demoralized. We can't get, broken down by things not working out the way we expected, because it just shows us how to make it work out better next. And that's the darkness that leads to light. So one of the most powerful texts is going to come next from Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, I'm just give you a background of his life to explain, the importance of this. His father, who was the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe of Chabad, came to him and said, "The communists just won their revolution, and I don't see an end to them in the near future, and it's going to be your task to deal with it." He became sick very shortly after and passed away, leaving Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson with the task of handling Judaism in Soviet Russia under the communists. The communists immediately began an anti-Jewish campaign in Russia. And so the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, had to arrange an underground system of schools and mikvahs and whatever else he could do hiding. And if people were caught, they would be sent away to Siberia. And hundreds of Chabad rabbis and teachers were taken away. And he would sit there with students, 10 students, and he would say, "Are you willing to lay your lives down for this cause? If you are, then I'll accept you into the group." And they would promise. They would sit down, they would take oaths that I'm going to go ad mesiras nefesh, until giving up one's life. And he created a massive system, which was pretty much the only religious system to survive in communist Russia from 1917 until 1991. He was, for much of the time, he was enemy number one. He was the public face of the movement that was secret. So in 1927, he was arrested. He was taken to prison. And he wrote a book of what happened, and he called it "My Time in Hell." Short, it's not very long. Because he had a lot of support across the world, people began from other countries pressuring the Russian government to let him go. In America, the consulates, they had senators trying to pressure them to let him go. He was eventually he was going to be executed, commuted his sentence, and then commuted his sentence again, and banished him from Russia. He left Russia in 1927. So he was a man who suffered a lot. He suffered a lot. He wasn't old already. He wasn't young at that point, and he was physically abused, and they tried to emotionally manipulate him. He came out, and he said the following. He said, "If somebody would offer me a single moment of suffering for $1 billion, I wouldn't take it. But if somebody would offer me $1 billion for all my moments of suffering that I had, I also wouldn't take it." Because he saw those moments as powerful and important. Not that we look forward to it. We're not trying to find suffering. The opposite, we're trying to end suffering. But when it happens, we're supposed to appreciate it as not useless. It's not empty. It's important. So we have a lot of suffering that we've had in our lives. It's part of the human experience. We're born crying for milk and teething. But we have to look back at our lives, all of our suffering, and come to that same conclusion, that we wouldn't trade it away. We wouldn't trade it away. That's not an easy thing to reach, to say that we wouldn't trade it away. But that's the ideal. The ideal is to say that all of those were useful. All that was powerful. And there's light that's coming out of it. So how could I give it away? How could I trade that? Without that, I wouldn't be me. I wouldn't have all this light. So that's Tzimtzum in a nutshell. So I'm going to summarize. Starting from infinity to not infinity requires the removal of everything. Tzimtzum Harishon, the first concealment. And then going from feeling God to not feeling God requires second concealment, where we change the quality of the light, like an analogy. And for us, the lessons for us is that we also have the infinite sense of self that we can have, and we have to remove it to make space for others. And when we do have darkness, we have to know that the darkness is important in order to create light. And that's the lesson. Any questions? Yes.
So this lesson was basically about the concealment of God's glory,
Mhm.
presence from us.
Yes.
And the purpose of that concealment is so that so that we can continue to seek after him, or
Yes, but also so that we can exist in the first place. When you have something infinite, if I were to be within God, I wouldn't feel separate. There would be no me. There would be just God. And so then there's nothing to strive towards. There's no ability to do something positive because there is only God. So the separateness from God is what creates the ability to strive.
oh, so that's the blessing. That concealment is a blessing that allows us to
Right.
kind of selfishly go after what
Yes.
it is that we want.
Right. And that was the point of creation in the first place, meaning there was infinite light before us. So then what's the purpose of existence? The purpose of existence is God saying, I'm going to create something outside of myself that doesn't feel like me, that will then be able to choose me. And that requires darkness, but it is darkness that can lead to light. Yes.
Bro, you talked about the three contractions. So you got Hashem contracting, you got Parsa in the middle, which is the curtain,
Yes.
and then you got isness over here.
So it was actually two contractions, which leads to three states. So you have step one is infinite, Ein Sof. And then contraction one leads to Atzilos level, which is no longer infinite, but doesn't feel like themselves. Then the Parsa, which then leads to Isness.
Okay.
So it's two contractions, which has, I guess, three separate states between them.
So God will talk normally to Moshe. What did Moshe do in order to bypass the whole process?
Excellent question. So in Kabbalah, it says that Moshe was a neshama de Atzilus, a soul of Atzilus, which is a soul that can somehow exist in two places at once, beneath the Parsa and above the Parsa at the same time. Where the term is from waist down man, from waist up God, which is that somehow, some way, bridging that gap allows him to speak in Atzilus, not before the first Tzimtzum, but in Atzilus to God, and also to us beneath the Parsa. So that's what it means that Moses is this intermediary between us and God, is that he can transcend the isness separation. So if you asked Moses, are you separate from God? He would say, no, I'm part of God. I'm one with God. I just can talk to you because I'm, able to transfer both. But if you also asked Moses, who's the purpose of existence, you or me? What would he say? He'd say, well, not me, because I'm part of God. You are. You're the one that feels separate. So that's what Moses is, the neshama d'Atzilus that exists above and below the Parsa. Yes.
So it seems like that separateness from God, I know a lot of people say, what is my purpose and everything. So it seems like the purpose is to do what it is that you want to do and incorporate God in it, but at the same time, not being so selfish to where you can allow others around you to have their own existence as well, like that story about the person who was in the synagogue and felt so offended because everybody was stepping on him, but it was his ego trying to control everything and everybody around.
Mm-hmm.
He has to allow that same freedom to everybody else that God has allowed to him.
Right. But also, ideally, what we want will be what God wants. Meaning the essence of us is supposed to be our godly soul, which shares God's desires. And so when we tap into that, then we, separate from God, will choose the same thing that God wants. So that would be the ultimate purpose.
What's
Yes.
Kind of, not just what you say, but kind of join what you say. I might interpret this a little bit wrong, but I always thought, I've heard, I guess, that the real thing is it's not, it's how we can serve God, not what God can do for us.
Right.
So I'm trying to combine, what she's saying with that thought process. Do you understand my point?
So I think that the idea is, I guess, serving God is a way to put it, but the idea would be that if we desire what God desires, then serving ourselves and serving God are going to be the same thing. And that's the highest level would say, God wants this, well, I also want that because my essence is a spark of godliness. So then it wouldn't be like a slave serving a master where they have separate desires, but one has more dominion or power. But instead that, it's more like a child continuing their parents' legacy where I desire what they want. But it requires the separateness for your choice to be valuable. Because otherwise, it's not a choice, it's a robot. They even say that Mount Sinai wasn't the ultimate level of the acceptance of the Torah, Talmud says. Mount Sinai was too much revelation. It was too much godliness, so that, of course, they chose the Torah. When was the real choice of the Torah? Was by the story of Purim, where the people didn't feel God. There was no Mount Sinai revelation, and yet they kept their faith.
Robert, from a Kabbalistic perspective, why is it that we cannot see God and live? Why if we're a part of it,
Mm-hmm.
or her, whoever, why can we not? That's the question.
So, there's two ways to approach it. Way one is the desire to cleave of the soul is very powerful. It's compared to a flame that's like constantly striving up. And they say that they used to say that those who learn Kabbalah with too much divine revelation wouldn't survive. The Talmud says that there were 4 people who entered the orchard of Kabbalah learning, and one of them just straight died. His soul just left his body. It's called kalot hanefesh, the soul exiting the body. The soul has learned so much that it can't handle the separation. The other sense is that it's about infinity, which is if you transcend the tzimtzum level, the first tzimtzum, then there is no space for you. There is only God. You're not going to feel yourself anymore. And so then your sense disappears. If you take a candle and stick it in the sun, it ceases to be a candle. It just is subsumed into the fire that is the sun. So even with distance, the soul is constantly yearning to come back. If you take away the distance, the soul just becomes God. So I don't know if seeing is the right word, but experiencing that to that intensity just won't allow a separateness to exist. All right. Have a wonderful day. See you next week, hopefully. Thank you.
Looking at this picture real close, you know what I noticed? He's left-handed.
You're right. How would he choose that? Interesting.
Putting his fill
That is really